So we've got synths in both the Tracker Plus and Mini now, and I thought I'd run through some basics and best practices for beginners. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of each synth engine or preset, but I'm going to discuss things that will apply to working with these synths overall, for you to get the most out of them. This also includes a section on chords. I'm using a Tracker Plus in this video, but all of these practices apply to the Tracker Mini as well. I also assume you know your way around the Tracker basics. If not, I have a video for you in the description. For the sake of transparency, I paid for my own Mini but got sent the Tracker Plus by Polyend at no charge. This is not a review, but I still wanted to let you know up front, and also wanted to thank Polyend for sponsoring this video. At the time of producing this video, I was using Tracker Plus firmware 1.0.2. Let's jump in. It makes sense to knock out some of the top level basics before we get into how chords work. This is a synthwave type pattern I made that 100% comprises of synths from the Tracker. So let's solo the lead melody so I can show you some stuff. As you can see, we're using Synth 3 for this melody. To access its parameters, hover over one of its cells and press the Instrument Parameters button. You'll see that I'm using a VAP Synth preset. This page also shows you the basic mixing and effect parameters, which is self-explanatory. If I wanted to edit the patch, I just press the Edit Patch button in the contextual screen menu. This takes me to all the synth parameters. We're not going to mess with that at the moment, so let's go back by pressing the back button. We can addition different presets for this melody by pressing the Load Patch Contextual button. This opens a drop-down of the VAP Synths presets. I believe there are currently 250 synth presets across all engines on the device. So you can see the preset I use for this melody is actually a pad, which brings me to the first tip. Make sure your addition patches in both a higher and lower register, because they can sound very different and are way more versatile than they first appear. If you press the left contextual preview button, it sounds a low note. If you press the right button, it plays a higher note. I know I'm pointing out the obvious here, but I initially completely missed the left button and was just previewing the high notes, which limited my patch decisions. The way I prefer to audition sounds is by just scrolling through them as the track is playing. This changes the sound to the selected preset without actually loading it or overriding your original patch. As we back out of the menu by pressing cancel, you can hear that our original patch is still loaded. Let's go to the pattern and just unmute the rest of the song. From the pattern window, let's go back to our melody synth. Click load patch again and scroll through a couple of these patches in context to hear if anything else fits our palette. Say we find a patch that we like more, all we do is click confirm in the contextual button to properly load it into our project. From there we can tweak it to taste by clicking edit patch and messing around with the parameters. The Tracker Plus has 8 stereo audio tracks and an additional 8 MIDI tracks. The synths can be used on either, but your normal sample instruments can only be used on the first 8 tracks. Even though you'll most probably be resampling and bouncing these synths, it makes sense to just get into the habit of keeping the first 8 tracks clear for sampled instruments while using the MIDI tracks for synths and external gear. This is obviously just a recommendation though. Polyphony refers to the amount of notes that we can play simultaneously. If a synth's polyphony is set to 1, it means it's mono and that just one note can play at a time. So on a mono synth, you can't play chords as you'll only hear one of the notes. It's great for bass lines, leads, and even some melodies. On the opposite side, if the polyphony is set to 6, it means that you can play a chord of up to 6 notes, or just that whatever you've got going on that track, it won't be able to play more than 6 notes at a time before cutting them off. I believe that all of these Tracker synths default to a polyphony of 1, meaning they're all set to mono. So what I recommend is, based on what you want to achieve, make sure that you adjust the polyphony before scrolling through patches while you're playing the track, because things might sound weird. If I'm writing a bass line or lead, mono makes sense, but I often want to write or audition chords, and for that you need a higher polyphony. For that reason, if I know I don't want mono, I always max the polyphony out to 6. If things sound messy from there, you can always just drop the polyphony incrementally until it works with what you're trying to achieve. You're not going to realize how versatile some of these synth patches are without messing around with the macros, which can be found on the second page of the synth parameters menu. We access that by hovering over the synth node cell and accessing the second page of the instrument parameters menu. These presets have been designed in such a way that you can get additional movement and modulation, or at the very least alternative tones, to make each patch your own or to fit your track better. It can often sound drastically different from the original, so make sure you always mess around and experiment. So you've messed around with your macros and actually want to automate some of them to get movement or the desired tonal changes before you render it. Well, we can do this with step effects. Go to the note you want to edit and press either the FX1 or FX2 buttons. In the FX dropdown, scroll down almost all the way to the bottom where you'll see a step effect option for each of the 6 available macros. From there you can make per step changes, or we can just use the full function to make ramps or custom waves. If there's something else you'd prefer to automate that is not part of the patch macros, you can customize the macros to the parameters you prefer. Simply go to your synth parameters, click on the edit patch, and then use the corresponding paths to get to each of the existing macros, which are labeled M1 through M7. But usually only M1 to M6 is used. I'm not sure what's up with that. These parameters are pretty straightforward. Set it up to your liking and get automating. Now let's discuss chords, as the tracker's approach is a bit different compared to other devices. I'm going to discuss 2 methods. You can play or program chords into the Tracker Plus using its pads or an external MIDI keyboard. The thing with the tracker is that only one step or note per track can sound at the same time, so if you want to play a chord, each note of the chord will have to be recorded or programmed onto a separate track. Basically, if your chord has 3 notes, you'll need 3 tracks. If it has 4, you'll need 4 tracks, etc. Firstly, press the instrument button and make sure you have the desired synth selected. To record a chord, press the rec button and select the amount of cells you will need by holding shift and using the cursors. Now play the chord on the pads or the MIDI keyboard. As you can see in here, we have our chord recorded now. If you don't want to play the chord, you can also manually just separately enter each note, like program it in. So you merely repeat this with different chords at different intervals to create your chord progression. But we'll get back to this a little bit later. I want to also show you a method that allows you to use a series of common chords by voicing a root note and then using a step effect to turn it into a chord. The cool thing about this is that unlike the first method, you don't need to use multiple tracks, it only uses one track. So we'll start by playing or programming in a root note. To do this, we arm for recording and we play a single note. Again, make sure you have the desired synth selected in the instrument lane. You can double check that by pressing the instrument button and navigating to the synth or instrument you want. If we play this, only this one note will sound, but if we go into the cell and press and hold either of the effects buttons, you'll see that right at the very bottom of the list there's a step effect called MIDI chord. I'm not going to go super deep into these chord presets. I highly recommend that you experiment and read the little info blurb that Polyend added to the left of this list. They do this with a lot of functions, which is really cool, where they explain how these work. All it does is that it basically takes your programmed root note and then it adds additional notes to make different chords out of it. Once you've selected the MIDI chord step effect and release the effects button, while we still have the effects column selected with the recording armed, we can use the jog wheel to scroll through and hear the different options. We'll just do a basic major chord, which we can get by selecting 047. If you play this, because we selected C as our root note, it will sound a C major chord. As with the previous method, you can just repeat this at the desired intervals to create your chord progression. So whether you write your chord progressions using multiple tracks with single notes or whether you use the MIDI chord step effect, I recommend that you render them to audio. If you opted for the former, rendering it to audio will free up valuable track space occupied by the single notes. So this brings us to rendering and resampling. Because we only get to have 3 active synths per project at the moment, it makes sense to get in the habit of bouncing, rendering or resampling our synth parts to free up the synths if we want to use them on more than 3 tracks, which for me is almost always the case. So even though the step effect method doesn't take up multiple tracks, it does hog one of the 3 active synths, which is not ideal. To resample a chord or chord progression, make sure you have rec enabled, then simply select the notes but also the length you want your sample to be. Make sure you get this right because the tracker will hard cut at the end of that sample based on your selection. Once you've got your selections, press the More Contextual Screen button once. You will see a Render Selection Contextual button on the left. If you're rendering single chords, I recommend you name them accordingly to avoid your instrument list getting messy. I'll just use the auto name feature for now though. Once the name is sorted, you can either just bounce the synth to a sample or you can render and load, which is what we're gonna do. This bounces the synth to a sample but then also automatically loads it in as an instrument onto your list. Once the process is done, the sample will be listed in your project sample loader where you can preview it. The cool thing about rendering or resampling your synths is that since it's been converted into a normal tracker's sample instrument, you now have a whole bunch of possibilities for further designing what your chords sound like or how you use them, because you have the option to chop them up, pitch them, adding different effects, etc. You can do things that you couldn't do when it was just the raw synth, basically. Finally, you can either bounce each chord separately or you can bounce it as a multi-chord progression and then just chop the individual chords out of the big sample. I hope this gives you a bit more confidence when working with these wonderful tracker synths. I was pleasantly surprised by how versatile and diverse they are. If you have any questions or recommendations, please drop a comment. Until next time, tot ziens.